Hey guys, welcome back to the new video. I hope you guys are doing well and having a great session while learning how to get interacted with Helm. So in our last video, we actually talked about how do we install Helm on the different operating systems what we have, and based on those operating systems you had a different process on getting the installation of Helm done. So we covered on how to do it installation on a Linux and a Windows based operating system precisely, but we also had a very small walkthrough on how to do it on a Mac based operating system. Now in today's video we will be doing our first chart deployment, where we would be creating the smallest entity of a Kubernetes, which is a namespace, but everything would be done using Helm. So let's directly get onto that particular section. We had actually used a Linux based operating system also to perform an installation of Helm, and in this video we'll be using the same setup to work on our first chart, which can be implemented using Helm. So I have already logged myself into the machine and I have created a folder called Helm, which currently does not contain any files or folders. So let's start with initially creating a temporary folder where we will be putting all the Helm related files which were mentioned or which it's required for doing setup of Helm chart. So the first file which we will be creating is chart.yaml. Now chart.yaml is basically the configuration, or basically it's an informational file for the chart or the deployment which you want to do using Helm. So let's create a chart.yaml. So it should contain all the information related to your chart. So let's do something like API version v1. Then let's put something as infrastructure as application. Let's put description as my first Helm chart. I think we are good with this information. The next thing we would be creating is a file called values.yaml. So values.yaml file, it is basically a configurational file which contains your key value pairs, which can be used in your main configuration file of the Kubernetes which you will be defining. So what I mean by this is, let's say I want to create a namespace with the name of first ns representing the namespace. So let me put it as the name of the variable as namespace and its value to be first ns. And let's also decide on the labels of the namespace, which I'll be putting is labels and first label to be label 0. Okay. So we have this value specified in the values.yaml file. Okay. Now the next file which we need in the parent location is folder called templates. So we do npdir templates. Templates is the folder which contains all of your configurations related to your Kubernetes. It could be your namespace.yaml, pod.yaml, deployment.yaml, services.yaml, create any of that. So let me go inside the templates and let me create a file called namespace.yaml. So vim namespace. So now the configurations which would be written in this file are basically the Kubernetes stuff. So I hope you are familiar with this. So to start with is first we specify the API version. Let me put it as v2 kind namespace metadata name. Now comes the picture of values.yaml. Now what we want to do is we want to parameterize the value of the namespace, and we want to fetch this particular value from our values.yaml file. Now if I just get outside of this file for a moment, if I just cat the values.yaml, so you would see that my variable name is namespace and it is defined inside a file called values.yaml. So the way to relate both of them in the namespace.yaml file is we use something called Jinja templating, and here you put dot values dot the variable name, so that would be namespace. Okay, and again similarly I also want to get the label name picked up from my values.yaml file, so I'll do it in a similar fashion. So it will be dot values dot labels dot, let's just check the variable name, it's first label. So that's first label, close the parenthesis, and we are good with this configuration. Okay, now we have the required files. So this is the basic, the minimal requirement of files which are required for you to start with your Helm deployment. So in this video we are trying to cover how to do it for a namespace using a Kubernetes file and deploying it through Helm. Now the other thing is we want to connect a check whether our configurations which we have mentioned, that is correct or not. So you would have seen in any of the editors which you use, you would have used something called a lint. It could be a Python lint, a JavaScript lint, which basically checks your configuration and your indentations and your overall structure of the code which you have written. So we have something very similar in Helm, which lets you validate the configurations which you have written, right? So before starting that, let me connect to my eCase cluster. Okay, so that is connected. So let's first do a helm lint. Okay, so you see there are multiple issues what we can see, and since this is an interactive session, so we are bound to get this, and we can also get this result. So if you see, the lintings throws on errors like your chart .yaml should contain a variable called name, your chart.yaml should contain a variable called version, and this is an information, your templates validation, your chart.metadata.name is required. So let's try to resolve them one by one. So let's first do it in the chart.yaml. So it requires a name, so let's put name as first ns deployment, and let's put version as 1.0.1. Okay, great. So let's do a helm lint again. So we have the first two errors as resolved. Now let's see, is executing this namespace.yaml, and it says a null pointer evaluating interface first label. Okay, so let's first check on values.yaml. So we have labels, and I think I did some typo in the templates folder. So yeah, so let me replace this with the current value, and let me do a helm lint. Okay, perfect. So So you see the value initially when we checked was that one charge has failed. Now we have 0 charge has failed. So like this we can say that now the configurations which we have mentioned in our Helm chart, they are correct. Now for the other thing which you can do is you want to know what kind of or what will be the configuration which will be deployed when you run a Helm install. Now Helm install is the command which actually executes the configurations in your chart and gets it live. So if I do a Helm install, I need to provide basically two parameters, and there are other optional parameters which can be mentioned, but I'll be trying to focus precisely on two parameters. So when you do a Helm install, you need to specify a chart name. A chart name is just an identifier for the configurations which are deployed using Helm. Now if I want to give my chart name as first ls, and the second parameter which goes with the install command is the folder location which contains your charts. So I'm already in the location of my charts, therefore I specify it as to be as the current folder. And as I was mentioning a few minutes earlier, that if I just want to see the configurations which is to be executed, so we just to be sure on the configurations, add a parameter called --try run. When you execute this, it will actually show you all the replaced values from the values.yaml in the namespace.file, and it also shows you whether the configurations are correct. So you can see in our condition, there's some error which is being thrown. It says unable to recognize no matches for kind namespace with a version of v2. So let me change it again and rename it to let's do a try run again, hoping things to be working this time. Okay, yeah, you see, so these are some of the metadata which will be displayed once you have a Helm running chart, and this would be the actual configuration which will be deployed. So if you see, the values which we had specified in the values.yaml are being replaced when you try to do it using the command helm install, and these configurations looks correct to me, so I'll be proceeding with my deployment. So the another command which we could actually look into and check for the existing Helm based deployments, we could do a command called helm ls, or you could type it as helm list. Both execute or give you the same output, so nothing to worry about. So currently we see that there are two deployments which are done by someone else for on this particular system, and we just want to deploy our Helm chart using the configurations which we have specified. So to install the Helm chart, we will be running the same command again, but without the dry run parameter. So it would be helm install first ls and the current location for using the charts configuration files. So let's wait for this. Okay, so you see we get the output message, and you see that the name of the chart would be first ns and the namespace will be default, and to list your chart, you again run the same command called helm list. So you see, now we have a first ns chart deployed under the helm, and we remember that the namespace name which we have created, so that would be first ns. Now let's look for this namespace in our Kubernetes cluster. So we do a kubectl get ns by grep and first ns. Okay, perfect. So we see that this particular namespace was created 49 seconds ago. Now let's check for the label which we had put, or which should actually be reflected in this particular namespace. So we do a kubectl describe ns and the namespace name. So we should have a label called label01. Perfect. So you see that we have the same label which we have specified in our namespace configuration file. So you see, we have defined the key name as first label, and the value which should be populated, it should come from the values.yaml file, which should be your label01. And upon describing the namespace, we have the same label getting reflected. So just to reiterate on what we have done in this particular video is we covered the minimal requirement of files which would be required to do your Helm based deployment. We tried to create the smallest entity of a Kubernetes setup, which is a Kubernetes namespace, using Helm Charts. In our Helm configuration, the basic files which is required is charts.yaml, your values.yaml, and your templates folder. Now charts.yaml is an informational file which contains all the informations related to your chart. It will be the version, it will be the name, it will be what kind of an application or infrastructure which you are deploying, some kind of a description you can mention, and the API version for this particular chart. Values.yaml, it contains your key value pairs which you actually want to reflect in your QSpec files. You can specify all the configurational static values which will be replaced when you do a Helm based deployment. Templates folder is the folder which contains all your Kubernetes related specification files which we call as QSpec files. In this video we covered using a namespace. So we had defined a file called namespace.yaml which contains your minimal requirements in order to create a namespace on a Kubernetes cluster. We also learned about how to connect all the values which you specified in your values.yaml and get it reflected in the namespace configurations when you execute it. We also learned about how to validate our chart configurations using a command called helm so which actually tells you whether your specifications or configurations which you have written on is correct or not. So helmlint is used for that. We have also learned about how to list all the charts which are deployed using Helm, so you can get all the details related to that particular information. We also learned about how to check just the configuration file which will be actually deployed by the command called helm install, and by specifying the chart name, which in our case was first-ns, and it also contains one parameter where your charts are located, and with an option called the minus dry run, which is only print upon your configurations which will be deployed. And just to install or basically deploy that particular configuration, you just remove the dry run parameter. So that was all about this video. I hope you liked it, and if there are any questions, feel free to add it in the comment section. In our next video, we will be discussing on what all other commands are available for our Helm charts. How can we make and reflect the changes on the fly for all the charts deployment which we do. And if you would see in the command output of Helm list, there is something called revisions, which is basically the version of the application which is being deployed. So we'll try to add multiple revisions to our chart, and we also try to revert back to a certain revision based on our requirements. So there are commands to do that in Helm, and we will be discussing more of that in our next video. Thank you.